Chapter 24. Anthor. The realm of Anthor healed. The cities of Antas, Kerith, and Karysands drawn together like they had never been before. The slave trade diminished, much to the efforts of Gail Redmond, who was appointed High Sheriff of Antas, dared her counterpart in Kerith. With the belief in magic no longer forbidden, inquisitors became freedom riders under Gail's leadership. They freed slaves and imprisoned traders, Talia acting as Gail's right hand. Katlyn's family, scattered during the invasion, survived and returned. Her home became the site of many shared dinners, where Haille experienced a closeness and familial atmosphere he had never as a boy. The High Council of Karysands returned and reinstated the Council of Elders in Antas with Yana on it. Mikeville Myers was elected king and served with a wise and steady hand. It helped that Yana Yansalil had his ear. Haille heard talk in the taverns of hopes that she would be elected queen herself someday. He knew she would never want it, but it filled him with pride nonetheless. There was always talk of him someday being appointed to the throne, which, after being an outcast so long, he had trouble getting used to. Now, on the rare occasion he had a seizure in the city, he would wake in the house of whichever citizen had reached him first. Families eagerly took him in, and while he recovered, they would fetch his most loyal friends and guards, the reinstated Order of Oban. So although he woke in unfamiliar surroundings, his friends would be at his bedside, Val or Chloe and even Cody, the left to Chloe's right. But some things remained familiar, and Haille was glad to return to some routines as before. He and Katlyn attended classes at the academy, albeit their standing in the eyes of other students and teachers had changed. Katlyn spent hours with Master Gilbert, reading books in the now open occult section. She was determined to learn more about the bracelet on her arm. Nathan joined them, learning all the things of the world he had not when he was taught only the dark arts and sequestered alone at Drowstrom. In the evening, Nathan became teacher and taught Gunther and Haille some of what he had learned. These were peculiar sessions for Haille, for oftentimes after hearing the words of enchantment, it was as if he had heard the words before, and the spell came easily to him, as if he had known it all along. His strange dreams persisted, in which he beheld visions of magnificent cities, blue forests, and towers floating in the clouds. He saw faces he knew he had never met, and heard voices, music, and songs that were novel and yet familiar. He would have thought himself mad if it had not been tied so closely to the spell from Adamantus. Although he still did not understand it completely, he knew it was some sort of gift, and he learned to live with the voices, the dreams, the whispers, and the strange sensations of knowing without knowing, considering them companions, not unlike the ever-present jays. But it came with a price. Dark memories sometimes invaded his dreams, and the melancholy he knew in those first weeks in Kerith or in the dungeons of Drowstrom would return and keep him from sleep for days on end. It left him as weak as if he had experienced a seizure, the sense of loss overwhelming, for he mourned for so many he had known, and also those he had not. Haille missed Adamantus keenly during these episodes, especially now in this new world where magic was believed in once more, where imagination and lore had their proper place, and Anthorians spoke with pride of their days fighting alongside the elves. Especially on the anniversary of the Battle of Karysands, when Oion and Amberlyn, Mikeville, and the Higher Council all met in Antas for a feast commemorating the battle. A toast was raised to the elves, even though none were present. Haille felt their absence. Even though messenger birds had been sent, the elves had been silent since returning to Sidon. So when he looked down the table through the dancing crowd and thought he saw a familiar angular face, Kayleaf moving about, his hood drawn up, Haille was sure it was just wishful thinking. A server moved to clear his plate, and Haille noticed his tattooed hands. "Prince Haille," a familiar sonorous voice said next to his ear. "Lazalorn, my brother awaits you to follow him." Haille picked out Kayleaf waiting by the door, a still figure among his friends, lost in revelry. Chloe and Gunther danced close together, as did Cody with a gaggle of young women from noble houses. Even Val was up, having been dragged into the center of things by Yana. Nathan, Talia, and Katlyn held hands and spun in a wild circle about Gale, who crossed her arms, but did proceed to tap her foot. Darrett had even joined them from Kerith with his wife Celine, a woman of luminous beauty. Haille felt his heart full with love for them all, and yet he knew someone was missing. "I will seek your brother, then." Haille passed the tables, wine-stained and scattered with crumbs and chicken bones, and followed Kayleaf out through the courtyard and over the drawbridge. They continued through the city, where taverns and dance halls were noisy with more celebrations. Haille felt apart from it all, even if he had been at the center of the events that were celebrated. Strange how being at the center is so isolating. Kayleaf led him down a side street to the edge of the outer boroughs and stopped just at the edge of a field. Haille could smell animal pens and see the shapes of sheep grazing in the dark. A brook gurgled close by. He could still hear songs from the dance halls, a woman's shout, a dog barking, empty pots clanging as they were tossed into the scullery for later cleaning. "She's waiting," Kayleaf said. Haille knew who she was. He walked into the meadow, by all signs alone, except for the jays who had found him and leapfrogged one another in fluttering bursts as he proceeded. Then he heard her voice. "Haille!" He looked up, startled, half believing it was his own mind playing tricks on him, but there she was, substantial and as real as the black pony beneath her, tearing at the grass and chomping it in its teeth. She did not dismount. "Violin!" Her smile flashed white in the darkness at the sound of his voice. He was glad for that. "Your people have been quiet. There are many changes afoot, but you and your people are thought of as friends. So do the elves still wait in isolation? Have they returned to their forests forever, or shall I see them again?" It was a question asked with the tact of a statesman, worthy of the countless meetings Haille had sat in of late, fighting sleep, but what was implicit in it was a much greater personal concern, whether or not he would see her again. Bending down closer to him, she spoke as if confiding a secret. "You saved us from isolation, but change takes time. The elves are slow to change, as are your people, but change is coming. The forces have been set in motion. The dam is broken. No one can stop that flow. We are about. You have been among us, in disguise then." Now she looked down into her breast, as if bashful. A soft answer followed. "Yes, many of us have been." "Why did you not reveal yourselves?" "We were meant to watch, assess, gauge the hearts and minds of the Anthorians, to see if they are ready for further contact. These were not personal journeys. Is this?" She leaned back again as if to consider, worked the reins in her hands and shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know. Gandalin sent me with a message for you, and insisted I deliver it in private. My brothers acted quite surprised by it." She looked to the castle, her scarred cheek facing him. "Perhaps he was acknowledging that I wanted to see you. I missed our conversations too." Her expression grew softer, but he could tell something held her back. "Haille, I am to tell you that the elders of my people still believe in you. Their alliance is strong, but their final decision has yet to be made. You have faced those demons of the outside world, but to move on, you must face those inside you." There was sympathy in her voice as she reached out to him, as she had in the room with Adamantus' body, but this time drew her hand away before making contact. A breeze stirred the air, and the treetops of Warthorn Forest swayed in the distance. "Is that all? What does it mean?" "I don't know completely. Gandalin recited it to me. He is an enigmatic elf, but he is wise." Haille nodded, taking in the words, turning them over in his mind, but to little avail. He crushed a tuft of grass beneath his foot. Sion landed on the back of Violin's pony, while Sapphire nestled on her neck. "Violin, where is Adamantus?" "We took him, carried him north, on roads only our people know, and returned him to his homeland. There are people who love him there, and will honor his memory. I miss him, Violin. Sometimes I feel that the realm has healed, and yet I have not. I am the morose heart of a jubilant kingdom." "I know," she said, her expression sorrowful but her voice urgent. "I know. There is little more I can say except that I believe in you, Haille. Let your heart be soothed by that, to whatever extent it can be. Now I'm afraid I have to go. Please, don't go now. Join us in the hall. It is not the time yet. Will I ever see you again? That will be up to you." She pulled on the reins and the pony lifted its head, but before she rode away, she bent down beside him, her hand on his shoulder. She spoke as if reciting an enchantment over him. "Albreth Alfrin sein, Trulit Nefril nein." Then she leaned back in the saddle again, smiling. "Hail, Elk Rider, Prince of Storms." A long pause passed between them until Haille added, "I would trade one of those titles to know what is required of me." "What is required of you?" "Yes. Movement." There was a shift in the air, and she was gone. Chapter 25. Festos. For Haille, movement meant west, but it was not until the next spring that he knew it was time to leave. He set out under the low clouds and weak light of the early morning on foot. There was no need for a horse. In his mind, his errand was one that would move at its own pace, outside of the daily rhythms of ordinary time. He donned a worn traveling cloak and kept Elkhart well hidden. He brought just a few luxuries, a sturdy pair of boots and a loaf of fresh honey oat bread from the castle bakeries. He bought cheese from a market stall in a village along the trade road, and knew he had meals for the next few days. The roads were bordered on either side by the long, fresh grasses of early spring. Cows grazed, working back towards their summer heft, alongside sheep, their coats still short from their last shearing. Haille passed many a farm worker, bags of seed on their backs and plowshares balanced on their shoulders. At night, he slept in the common rooms of inns or shelters between fields with farmhands, paying his way in the latter by helping with morning chores. He used the old moniker Katlyn had given him on their first adventure together, Derek. That had served him well as an alias throughout his travels. After a week's time, he reached his first destination, Karazhan's. He had visited the city the year before with the Antan Council of Elders, when crowds thronged into the streets, banners hung from windows, and citizens tossed flowers in the air. But it was with some relief that he passed down the causeway and into the city incognito, an ordinary citizen. In this guise, he could appreciate the city's return to the ordinary. The causeway itself was busy with market stalls and hawkers. The new gates were open, and traffic passed through unhindered by obstacle or memory of the fighting that had taken place there. The plaza was a circus of merchants, traders, sailors, longshoremen, market women, and scampering children, not to mention the dogs, cats, chickens, donkeys, pigs, cows, horses, and other livestock that bumped together cheek by jowl. As Haille passed through city streets down to the docks, livestock was replaced by carts of fish. Steaming kettles of crab, mussels, prawn, and lobster boiled over fires in taverns, the smell making his stomach rumble. A few times his eyes wandered skyward to the fire tower that rose above the rooftops, but in the spring sunshine against the backdrop of a cerulean sky, it appeared benign. The acts of violence acted out upon it, distant memories. He made his way to the docks. There was a time when the bustle and press of so many people in the narrow space of the docks would have intimidated him, but he had been to many docks and quays since. He reflected that passing through in freedom and not as chattel was immeasurably better, the absence of slaves being traded a boon to his heart, and thanks in no small part to the efforts of Gail Redmont herself. He fell into step with the dance of trade, haggling, loading and unloading, that took place along the waters of the harbor, moving down to the far end of the quay, the intent in his mind clear. He found a skiff, the size he wanted, and inquired with a boy doing odd jobs on the dock about the whereabouts of the captain. He pointed to a pair of older men playing dominoes beneath an awning. They could have been brothers, their features weathered in identical fashion by the same wind, sun, and elements of the open sea. But the one on the far right, wearing a wide-brimmed, faded straw hat, introduced himself as Jeddah, captain of the Mist. Haille haggled with him briefly over the price for a trip to the Reaches, and after he paid the old man half up front, Jeddah stepped away from his game, called the same boy to him that had given Haille directions, and they set to preparing the Mist for launch. Haille did his best to stay out of the way, sitting with his knees together on a thwart as Jeddah and his assistant, the boy named Mark, moved about the craft, catching the wind with the sail and counterbalancing the heeling of the ship. Soon the city slipped beneath the horizon, and even the fire tower grew small and disappeared altogether. Jeddah remained at the tiller, while Mark threw a fishing line over the side. They coursed over the surface of the sea, cutting a foamy bow wave and leaving gentle eddies in their wake. Haille settled against the gunwale, lost in thought, and it was only at word from Jeddah that they had reached some of the deepest waters off the coast that Haille broke out of his torpor, stood up, one hand on the mast, the other reaching beneath his tunic for the pouch he had carried all the way from Antas. It was a simple leather drawstring pouch. He did not dare open it, for the contents were dangerous and had caused enough pain and strife already. He could see the 5 moonstones. However, clearly in his mind, giving thought to the previous holders, each a victim or victimizer, or both. Kyruna of the Morvant, King Owain, the nameless warrior of Dralstrom, Lady Annabeth Chastain, and Master Gilbert, the librarian. Haille hoped that no stones remained, for they had been tools in so much deceit, betrayal, and bloodshed. They felt heavier than their true weight as he dangled the bag over the waters. With an onrush of darkness, in his mind or real Haille could not tell, he felt the weight of a presence that he had not felt since that day in the hall in Solidor. That voice, that consciousness of the magus, the splinter of his mind broken off and bound to the stones, remained. You drop these into oblivion, power erased by nothingness. Are you not curious at what the infinite darkness holds below? That is not my path now. I belong to life, light, this world above. You thought it yourself on the tower, before me. The wind-blown world cares not if you passed a young man or old. In the long arc of time, it does not matter. You do not matter. Nothing matters. Nothing is real, certain or inevitable, except the nothing that awaits you. Surrender. Haille let go of the pouch as if it had grown hot in his hand. The light of day surged back around him, his thoughts his own once more, yet his hand still felt heavy, as if the weight of the stones and the menacing consciousness within them remained. Jeddah and Mark were staring at him wordlessly. Haille gazed at the face of the sea, the peaks and troughs of waves rolling beneath them. The surface was undisturbed, as if nothing had even been dropped into its depths. "I've done what I came to do," he said. "Turn us back to shore." Haille trudged eastward, pushing through spring storms that soaked the roads, left branches dripping from their bright new leaves, and the sky awash with broken clouds. Sleep did not come easily, for the old voices, present in his mind since the day Adamantus died, were restless, their whispers murmuring on the edge of his consciousness. When he did sleep, he didn't find rest, but instead was transported into the dreams of others, colored by loves, passions, conflicts, and snippets of life journeys that were not his own. It created a jumble in his head, and at the worst of times he could not separate himself from whatever it was that had been transferred into him. Most painful of all, lodged in his chest like a barb, was the unanswered question from the stones, the question turning his own words back on him. In the light of so much loss, what did it matter? He bypassed Antas, walking scant-traveled trails through forest and field, and entered the lands he had crossed with Katlyn nearly 2 years before. A few times he slept in the very same hollows and clearings they had camped in together. It made him grateful for her steadfast loyalty, and made him miss her company. But this was a journey he had to make on his own. One morning, after sleeping beneath a cherry tree, he woke, covered in blossoms. One in particular spun down from above, hovered on his knuckle, and twirled like a tiny pink fairy. Then it dropped into the grass with the other hundreds of fallen blossoms, to grow still and wither. He picked up the trade road again as it curved northward outside of Scottsdale. It was busy with carts, their sides dirty with mud, hauling seed to planting farms. A few farmers offered him rides on the backs of their wagons. He took them when he could, and his feet appreciated the rest. None of the farmers gave him a second look. He played the part of itinerant wanderer well. Outside of the city, no one recognized him. He passed the edges of Garn's Grange, the fields busy with workers, the livestock plenty and healthy. The thought of visiting crossed his mind, but he preferred the silence and anonymity the solitude of the past days had given him, and so he continued on, a figure passing on the margins. After a few more days, he passed the turn which would have led him to Pathis home. He had kept up a correspondence with the swordsmith, who, after the invasions, had returned to his farm, his sons and their families joining him, determined to stay close after the war. Haille's heart warmed with kind thoughts for the old man, who had known his mother and shown her generosity. But Haille did not stop. He walked upon the same paths he, Val, Cody, and Katlyn had taken, led by Gale in her guise of Avenger Red. Adamantus had ridden with them then, and the grief grew in him with every step he took. He had time to relive his mistakes, abandoning his friends, betraying the boys and girls at the Greystone Manor, shame burning in him now as it had then. When he reached Rivertown, he knew this was one place where he would make a stop, to refresh for the rest of his journey. Lorna read him unlike anyone else. As she stood in the doorway to River Ridge Manor and set eyes on him, his sinking shoulders, his downcast eyes, she spoke. "I know the journey you are on, Haille," she said, dispensing with his title and addressing him simply as he was. "I will have Sorrel prepare a room for you away from the others. We will see that you are not disturbed." "Thank you," he said, surprised by the lump of gratitude that caught in his throat. He slept in a tiny room on the ground floor in a wing of the manor still unfrequented by the residents. It was one of the first nights he rested well, although he woke early before the sunrise. Already standing in the doorway, a tray of breakfast in her arms, her hair tied back in an efficient ponytail, her face still lined from her pillow, was Sorrel. She stoked the embers of the fire as Haille slid out of bed, rubbed his eyes, and took a sip of tea. She settled down on a stool across from him. There was food enough for them both, as she buttered a raisin roll, dipped it in tea, and took a bite. She sat without speaking, as content in silence as in conversation. Haille found himself grateful for her unassuming company. After the fire grew brighter and the wood began to pop, she spoke. "You seek the desolation of the moors. They call to you." "How did you know?" She shrugged. "I have been called at times myself. I've journeyed there as part of my own training with Lorna." "I need the silence," he said. "The emptiness." Sorrel nodded, that unblinking stare of hers settling on his face. "You will find it. It will give you the space you need." "To air these voices in my head?" She nodded. "One does not pass through the trials you have without change." They said nothing more, and when the breakfast was finished, she lifted the tray and carried it out to the main house. There was nothing left for Haille to do but leave. He gathered his things and walked down to the Liam River, where he found a small rowboat with a young boy waiting in it, who, by the look of him, could have been Sorrel's brother. Like the girl, he was silent and acted as if he had expected Haille, allowing him to settle down on a thwart in the bow before shoving off. The only sound was that of the oars rotating in the oarlocks and the swift current of the Liam slapping against the bottom of the boat. When they reached the far side, Haille thanked the boy. He nodded wordlessly and turned back to the opposite shore, where the sounds of daybreak, a rooster crowing, pots clattering, a chorus of songbirds greeting the sun, carried across the river. Haille turned away, fleeing the noise and commotion of others, and turned to the mountains. It was a good time to be in the Thestos moors. There was plenty of water as streams appeared, silver threads in the dells that provided him with an abundance of drinking water. With no shade but that of passing clouds, the day grew warm, especially as he climbed from one hill to the next. By midday he was sweating and tied his cloak about his waist. By night he shivered. After a few nights of such cold, he decided there was no rule governing his travels, so he moved by night as well, sleeping in the hours just before dawn when the stars dimmed, the sky grew blue and pink behind the mountains, and the wind settled. The voices in his mind had gone silent. Each day the Rim-Kur Mountains grew closer, the size and details becoming more and more clear. Morning would reward him with some new facet, a new avalanche moving soundlessly across the mountain's faces, or a new glacier that he could not believe he had not noticed the day before. The gods of rock were brutal in their natural beauty, on a scale of time and size far beyond Haille. What does it matter in the face of infinity? When his path ran out, at the sheer wall of the rising mountains, he knew he had reached his destination. It was no remarkable place, just another trough in the grassy, rolling sea of hills, but it felt right somehow. A large stone, some boulder released from the grip of the mountains, sat unaccompanied in the sunlight. Haille settled down on the leeward side, gathered a few bunches of grass, and lit a fire as the stars came out. He remained there for a few days, his food running low, but it mattered little to him. During the day he climbed up on the stone and sat, watching the sun in its gradual tracking across the sky. In the stillness, he reflected upon all that had transpired in the months before. the acts of courage and sacrifice he had witnessed in others, and the losses he still felt. But, as always, his thoughts came back to the same question. In light of all the loss, the sadness, the suffering, what did life and all the strivings it entailed matter? Like the consciousness in the stones had said, it left him unsettled, because he had indeed asked it himself. It felt as if he had pulled at the threads of his own self, and they had begun to fray. And yet, after tugging once, he could not stop. In a moment, while he took a break from his thoughts, he found a star that had been carved into the top of the stone he sat upon. So he was not the first to sit upon it. He pictured some other traveler, also seeking something impossible to articulate, trying to fill something unfillable inside of them. Next to the star, the artist had incised the words, "Starlight Stone." Haille mused to himself, picturing the stone as an extinguished star, fallen to earth to rest, its life on a grander scale than even the mountains and the moors. He traced the lines of the letters, only to feel them trembling beneath him. He flattened his palm to the rock. There was no doubt. Tremors were causing it to shudder. He looked to the mountain slopes for signs of an avalanche, but the plains of snow and rock were motionless under the bright sun. Then he saw them. They came soaring over the ridge, their legs floating above the ground, their knees bent, their manes flying. Haille laughed out loud to see them in their wild majesty again. The Thestos wilds. He had not seen the horses since his last journey into the moors in his search for the font of jasmine. There were even more this time, covering the slope as if they were land themselves. No wonder the earth shook so. As if they heard him laugh, they turned towards him, that entire wave of hammering motion. On the next ridge beyond, he saw even more. The starlight stone was shifting, as if forgetting its weight. They surged around him, a river parting around a rock. He knew this was the moment he had been searching for. His thoughts transcendent, it occurred to him that throwing himself to the ground beneath the stampeding horses would not be such a bad death. To be beaten into dust and nothing, left to float for eternity on the winds of the mountains. Seized by the horse's feral movement, Haille turned, ran, and leapt off the rock, kicking and screaming as the animals passed beneath him. He was amazed even further to land on one's back. It had a golden coat, a long, unruly mane, and fiery, rolling eyes. Riding upon a barebacked elk had prepared him to stay on, his instincts snapping back, even though this ride was much less gentle, throwing him up and down with each gallop. He lost concentration for a moment and slipped, sliding right off the horse, which, unlike the elk, had no concern for its rider. His hand seized the mane, and his fall was arrested. His feet were whacked painfully about by the horse's hooves. Off balance, the horse turned, and Haille was suddenly looking sideways, right into the wall of approaching animals. Perhaps this is the way, he thought. Death had come for so many. It was inevitable, as Ivan had said to him. It had come for his parents, his friends, Aurora, Victor Twenge, Adamantus, and so many others. But then he thought of the words of his friends, Val and Cody, Chloe and Gunther, Katlyn, Nathan, and Violin. He felt the draw of connection, to love, to a cause, and most of all, to the suffering he could and would choose. It would not be death that would extinguish him, he decided, but life. It seemed that life wanted now to punish him for the decision he made, the horse veering and turning, bucking. Haille's feet dragged on the ground, dirt stung his eyes, a hoof hammered his thigh. He became aware of the thickness of muscle between skin and bone. Maybe there was no returning. Maybe He had already cast his lot with death and surrender. He watched the rhythm of the animal's gait, then swung forward, caught his feet on the ground, and let the swift-moving earth send him flying backwards, and with that momentum, he made a last desperate swing, a flip upward, and remounted. He would live. He would not avoid his own destiny, the beauty or the pain hidden in it. He would live, and he would live with the precious foreknowledge given to him this day that he would not endure, that he would not last, that in the end, life would destroy him. There would be pain. His arm, his back, his eyes, his entire body told him that just now, but he would imagine, even contrive, a reason for it. He breathed deeply, knowing he was in death's embrace and understanding that it no longer mattered. Tears mingled their salinity on his lips. He was crying and laughing all at once. Perhaps this is what it feels like to be a king. The horse beneath him crested a ridge. The sheer speed and the rising wind nearly knocked him off. I'll have to train him. The horses took Haille as far as the Liam, crossing the moors at a tremendous speed and placing him close to Rivertown in a day. There he was able to wrestle his mount away from the herd. Afterwards, he rode the feisty stallion into town, creating a stir as his mount continued to buck and whinny. He broke down and bought a saddle, realizing that to ride bareback was not a luxury he could afford. It took a while to calm the horse once the saddle was on it, resulting in rope burns to his hands and bruises to his body. But by the end of the day, Haille had it running its paces in a corral at River Ridge, Lorna and Sora looking on, pleased. "You have found your spark again," Lorna observed. "It was a matter of choosing it," Haille said, dividing his attention between the horse and his companions. "And having friends to help point the way." Lorna smiled, settling against one of the fence posts. "What will you name him?" Sorrel asked. The name came to Haille without hesitation. "Festos, of course." The next day, with Sorrel, he entered a dark tavern on the edge of the water. It was built from the wood of scuttled barges and smelled of the tar in the beams and the beeswax candles on the tables, not to mention brandy, beer, and pipeweed. They found an adventurous barge captain with crooked hat and tanned skin and asked him how much it would cost to hire a barge from Rivertown to Sidon. "Well, I don't know, young sir. No one ever goes there. You don't actually mean to float down the great river into Sidon, do you?" "I do," Haille said. "I have friends to visit there. I'll pay you handsomely." The captain laughed and agreed, but said it would take him a few days to assemble a good crew willing to travel into the woods, and even then, he said they should expect deserters. Haille said that was fine and offered him his asking price. Then he and Sorrel returned to River Ridge and passed an hour taking turns riding Festos around the corral before joining the others for dinner. In the middle of the night, Haille woke to the sound of thunder as a storm rolled down off the mountains. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by a clap of thunder that sent the animals of the manor into a panic. Cows bellowed and donkeys brayed. Haille wrapped himself in his cloak and stole down to the stables, where he found Festos kicking at his stall. He calmed the horse, whispering to him and stroking his neck with a firm hand, as he had seen Yana do with horses before. The storm settled into a steady rain, the rumbles of thunder distant, the flashes of lightning over the horizon. Festos at rest, Haille propped himself in a window of the hayloft and savored the spray of raindrops on his face, his fingers tracing the scars on his wrists from his crib so long ago. Somewhere, he knew a leaf was falling, slicing through layers of air to hit the forest floor and become decay. A young man was stepping over a flowing gutter, ducking raindrops as he walked to his lover's home. A mother discovered dirt behind her sleeping son's ear and licked her finger before rubbing it away. The heads of daisies, their buds closed for the night, bobbed under the weight of the rain. Haille watched it all through the eye of his mind, illuminated by the liberating knowledge that love was the most precious thing in this life, and all the more precious because it would someday be lost. A tree root towed its way between castle rocks, nature putting the work of human hands in its place. A kettle on a hearth boiled over, a dancing ghost of steam balanced on its spout. Haille pictured Yana somewhere, next to a hearth fire, surrounded by children, scamps from villages, noble children alike. She would pull one close to her, perhaps one that she suspected was picked on, or wore a dejected face born of neglect or just shyness. She would smooth the boy or girl's hair and tell a story, perhaps his story. "Well, my little ones," she would say, "Haille was born in a storm."